Hello and welcome to another episode of Nationalist Radio America for the week beginning at October 29th, 2017. It's my birthday today, and I have deused, once again, thank you for joining me, Fuego, and the Western one here. We're here to talk about the white privilege checklist in sort of a comedic way. We don't want to get too serious about this because I don't think anybody actually takes this thing seriously, but it is worth talking about, and maybe we can get into more serious topics through discussing this. So once again, everybody welcome, and I'm going to go ahead and actually put the white privilege checklist on the screen for the viewer, and we will go through it as I read it here. Peggy McIntosh is the person who authored this thing, and supposedly it's been going around since the 1990s, but I will admit to not doing any sort of independent research on it. She's the Associate Director of the Wellesley College Center for Research on Women, and she had this study, I guess, that, some sort of epistemic privilege thing. So let's just get to the meat and potatoes of it. The following are examples of ways white individuals have privilege because they are white. Please read the list and place a check next to the privileges that apply to you or that you have encountered. At the end, try to list at least 2 or more ways you have privilege based on your race. So we'll go ahead and actually start off. First things first, does white privilege exist?
Yes, but not for the reason that liberals would like to say it does. I like to say that liberals are often right for the wrong reason. So in the context of white privilege, every group of people, every nation, every tribe wants to set up a society that will help themselves, right? No one sets up a society that helps people who don't live there. So naturally, white people are going to make a society for them to succeed based off of their traditions, common law, based on their religion, whether it's Christianity or what have you. It's the same with every society. Where the griping, the whining comes into play is that, there aren't enough resources and time spent specifically for catering to minorities. And that's not something you see in any society. You don't see that in Chinese societies, Latin societies. It's only white societies where their own cultural institutions are criticized and told to open up to people who have no historical stake in that country. And because white people, don't do that, they're criticized for being privileged.
I agree with Fuego that white privilege does exist, but it's just a product of being white in a white civilization. Just in the same way as, I would say that Asian privilege would exist in an Asian country. It's like, well, I'm privileged to be a citizen born and raised who is a part of who has the same genetics as the people who created the culture around me.
Okay, I would actually disagree. I actually believe that there is no such thing as white privilege. I think that white Western culture places value on the individual and their accomplishments and capabilities, and actually works to denounce nepotism as an institutional practice. And in fact, we have in our governments institutional affirmative action policies which actually favor minority groups as opposed to the majority population. So it may seem counterintuitive, but we actually work to increase the odds of success for those which are not white Westerners in our societies.
I could see that Western culture or white culture in general does tend to be unique in its placement of they value the merit of the individual over the race of the individual per se. They will be generally more accepting of an outsider if the outsider can be a positive on their culture.
I'll take the minority position. I actually truly do believe in some ways that white privilege does exist. However, I disagree. I think Fuego nailed it. It's the right idea, but for the wrong reasons. We can talk about. I see in many ways sort of the far left, right? And then I don't want to get too much into like the horseshoe theory of things. I think that's kind of silly. But it's interesting that really, if you think about it, the major disagreements between like the far right and the far left come down to sort of a deterministic explanation of how the world works. I think the left tends to think that class matters more and that wealth matters more. And I think that the right tends to believe that, like, genetics influence our behaviors a lot more than the left does. And this gets into kind of things like moral foundation theory, which we'll talk about in an upcoming video. But it's very fascinating to me. And I think that we do have a lot more in common with the far left than we give, I guess, credence to. So I think that if we're going to discuss privilege, the primary thing is, like, by virtue of being white, do we have some sort of privilege that applies nationwide? You guys already talked about this. Or not nationwide, but globally, shall we say. If I go to Ethiopia or China or Japan or Mexico, I wouldn't have privilege, right? So you guys already kind of talked about that. And I think a fair argument could be made that there would be a class-based privilege that I wouldn't have, right? But by virtue of my genetics, I may have an advantage on the native population. I may be able to innovate in ways that they may not. So I think there's definitely something to be said about privilege, and I don't think that privilege exists in sort of the meme way, right? But I think I think there is something to it.
Yeah, I'd say that depending on where you are, it affects your privilege, you could say. Depending on who you are, how much you make where you are, or your status where you are. Because, like, let's say you could be like a white person in Asia and still have some privilege if you're a wealthy white person, but maybe not as much as someone with the same amount of wealth who is an Asian person, and vice versa. You could honestly have more privilege. Let's say an Asian person comes over to America, and I have my white privilege or whatever, being a part of the culture that I'm surrounded in. I am better suited for it. I am more liked by people around me in general, or more trusted, or whatever. I could end up with more privilege, you could say, or just being in a better position than an Asian person with more money than me, because I'm in my own culture.
It depends. In certain cases, if you're a Western man, a European man, traveling, sometimes you can get respected more. I believe that's the case in Latin America, certainly in Africa. However, that does come with drawbacks. You can be a bigger target for thieves and the like, maybe even for, kidnappers or terrorists or what have you. But one thing that came to my mind when you were speaking is that sometimes, in one way, privilege is nothing more than, us taking advantage of the sacrifices and the advancements that our ancestors made. A lot of people, I mean, the left would like to say that we're, guilty for our ancestors, whereas the right says that we should always take accomplishment for what our ancestors do. And I think it's a little bit of both. If we have privilege, it's because our ancestors did great things, and we should be proud of what they did. They set up a great society for us to flourish in, for us to be successful in. And that is a privilege. It's a privilege to have ancestors who are hardworking and diligent. And I'm proud of that. And we should, instead of being guilty or feeling guilty or, embracing affirmative action, we should build on that success.
Yeah, I would dovetail on some of the stuff that you said with regard to genetics, right? And I think that part of what the left has done, and I think you guys kind of touch on with the right idea but the wrong reason, is that they conflate the idea of potential with privilege. And so, what do I mean by that? I would say that perhaps Westerners have greater potential as individuals than those who are not Western, right? And maybe this is due to genetics. Maybe it's due to specific cultural institutions that we have in place at a family unit level that give us an advantage. And I think that what we have done, though, to prevent privilege is, again, create government and social institutions which prevent us from really realizing our full potential, right? Because to do so, make, so to realize our full potential would mean that we elevate ourselves past other groups. And I think that we're not comfortable with that because of our empathy for them.
I think we have, as John Stuart Mill says, a real affinity for trying to intervene on behalf of nature. And I think that's kind of what this whole white privilege thing is. I think maybe the question is more not does privilege exist, but does privilege matter? I look at it very much the same way I look at sort of arguments about fatalism and solipsism, for that matter. Because if these things are true, right, if everything is predetermined, you still have to live life the same way as if it wasn't, right? Same with like solipsism. If we're all just brains in vats, we still have to live as if we're not brains in vats, right? So maybe the question is, does privilege matter? But we'll go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of this. So point one, and before I begin, I think it's kind of funny. I honestly think that if not 100%, at least 99% of this can be discredited by one simple reply. And so I'm going to try not to harp on that one topic, but it can be solved by simply saying, return to your native country, right? Return to your native country and all this can apply to you too. But anyway, here we go. Point one. I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. So again, if you're an African living in Africa, I think that would overwhelmingly be true. But can you arrange for your company to be people of your race?
I think the question itself doesn't make sense, really. Like, they don't take into account that like most people are around people like them because they're in their own nations, and like I would say like upwards to like 90% of like most people are in their nation of origin, or their people's nation of origin, or at least surrounded by their culture. Anyway, so like in that case, if you want to go her route, in that case, everyone would have some sort of privilege, and that shouldn't be a bad thing. The biggest issue with that is they're making it seem like it's bad to exist in your own country, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like you're literally saying like, it's wrong to be around people like yourself. It's directed at white people. Obviously, the title says like it's white privilege. They're saying that whites in particular are wrong for this, even though they wouldn't say Africans have privilege for being around other Africans in Africa. So that it just doesn't make any sense in general.
Totally, that's a great point. None of what you're going to see with this, leftism, cultural Marxism is consistent. It's completely hypocritical. They use universalist language to promote a very one-sided cause. So that's a great point. You're never going to see this for any other group. But I mean, this whole list is absolute garbage. Just sticking with number one, because we could go all day with this. I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. Yeah, I mean, people self-select into groups of their own. I mean, I'm from a very diverse and liberal part of the country, and I can definitely testify to that. In fact, the two colleges I went to, I mean, I was like the only person going out of my way to just judge people and hang out with people by their personality. There's always different ethnic groups just sticking amongst their own, and I don't want to get too riled up or anything, but a huge culprit of that are the international students from China. I mean, they exclusively choose to be amongst themselves. They make no effort to integrate into the quote unquote melting pot here in America. Whereas, at least black people, to their credit, will integrate. Latinos tend to have, some friends from different races. But even, those two groups will prefer to have friends of their same race. And there are entire neighborhoods all throughout America where you'll have single race neighborhoods. So yeah, just completely ridiculous.
I would say that right now, in a current state, you cannot, as a white person, arrange to be solely in the company of people of your race, right? You can arrange to be in their company, but not exclusively. And I think that's really a point that this list and this statement sort of leaves off. Yes, I can arrange to be in a group of my people, but not exclusively, because the question will be asked, especially if it's on a larger scale, why were there no people of color present? And that's not something that gets asked of people of color. If you are in a minority group, it is not asked of you, why are there no people of Western white origin present? So, yes, I can do that, but there will be a question asked, why were there no minorities included? Which is not something that is, again, asked of those people who are of, in the United States, currently a minority origin. If you are African, if you are Asian, if you are Latino, um, any other race other than white, you are not asked that question. And I think that's a real problem that that statement of privilege doesn't really address. And I think that kind of gets back to the point that you had, Deus, that if you are living in a country of your own people, then of course you can arrange that. And it shouldn't be a bad thing if you do that.
The example I like to use, and this has been going on since, well, I'd say probably the 90s. I remember when BET first came out, and sort of these you know, black American institutions really started popping up as far as my awareness of them. BET was a big one. Then of course there's the NAACP and all these other things. And I remember watching some movies and saying to myself, well, there's no movies with really just only white people, right? But if you watch these movies that have like black lead actors and black producers, everybody's black. And that's considered okay. And that was kind of one of my waking up moments back. I mean, I was a child back then. And I said, wow, that's really strange. Whites can't have their own movies, but I remember Dunkirk, right? Dunkirk is the most recent example, I think, where they say, well, it was just too white. What? You don't say that about Steve Perry's movies, right?
Absolutely, and that's a great segue into. We could knock out a couple of these with what you just said. So, for example, number 3, I can turn on the TV or open the front page of a paper and see people of my color widely represented. I can't do that. I mean, every commercial, it's super diverse, and I know it's on purpose. I know that the marketing director of that corporation chose those actors for no other reason than diversity. TV anchors, TV programs is just affirmative action everywhere. And it wouldn't be so bad, but if not for that, they're just rubbing it in with lists like this, because nothing on this list can be fulfilled by a white person in 2017. And this is all being pushed, this is all justification for just filling in every role with a person of color for no other reason to check off this checklist.
Yeah, I think that with regard to number 3, one big issue that I've seen lately, my daughter's in public school, and we recently got a memo about school photos, and there wasn't a white child in the material that they sent home. There were Hispanics, there were blacks, Indians, but there wasn't a single white child in all of the information that they sent home. And it makes me question, this is still a majority white country. Why are we not being represented in material that's being sent home by a public institution? And I think we really need to take a hard look at that.
Yeah, and going on the theme of this is a majority white country, like you said, most of these questions in general, like number 4, I really wanted to zone in on. It's like when I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, quote unquote, I am shown the people of my color make it what it is, or made it what it is. Yeah, like it's literally like, yes, that is the answer to that question. It's like, well, did they make it what it is? Yes. Okay, check. Keep going.
That's so funny. That's the exact one I wanted to talk about as well. And again, you're saying the exact opposite. So, for example, a Muslim in Detroit is maybe upset that, there are no Muslims in the founding fathers. Well, hey, you weren't there. Your people weren't there. And you're also seeing the BBC blackwashing British history. Apparently, the first Vikings were Muslims. I mean, it's the exact opposite, but we're beaten over the head with this. Oh, people of color are not seeing themselves in the history textbooks. Well, I mean, the people of color weren't there to found America. It's just a matter of geographic coincidence. And going off of Western man's point, we're focused and excluded on purpose so that other people can get their shoe in on this multicultural experiment.
Yeah, they want to say, like, specifically for white people, they want to say, like, well, your civilization, a lot of people contributed to your civilization. There's a, like, this, check out this based black guy over here that did this invention. Look at this stop sign that he made. It's like, well, now you've got to give up your entire civilization. You got to let mass immigration happen, whatever. It's specifically targeted at white people. Like, you're trying to start at the roots, say, like, you didn't found the nation that you founded, which makes no sense because, like, cultures come out of a people. Like, a people spawn the cultures that they're enveloped in. They don't just fall out of the sky onto whoever they will, but they're created by a particular people at a particular time under particular circumstances. And even where they are, even the place that they are has a lot of effect on, the people itself that make the culture itself. And all of this is being stepped on if you're white. Like, they're saying, like, well, you don't get that because you're white.
I think a really interesting part of all this, especially with regard to the expression of race in media, is that in terms of being able to see an ad or a television show with your race, is that if a black actor takes, or a brown or oriental actor takes the role of a white man, that is considered fine. And if a white person says, hey, that's a misrepresentation of history, the statement would be, well, why does it matter? However, if the reverse is true and a white actor plays the role of an Asian or African or and presumed to be African or presumed to be Asian figure in history, then that is seen as whitewashing history. So it's very interesting that there's a contradiction there. And say, well, why does it matter if your people aren't represented? Why does it matter if you do not see figures like yourself in this role or through this advertising? But at the same time, say, well, the issue is we're not being represented here, and that's not fair. But there's a clear contradiction where in the discussion of race and how it's expressed through media and advertising and through public institutions, that we just don't have a real honest conversation about.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue into number 9. I can worry about, it says racism here, but I like to change it a little bit. I can worry about race or racial issues without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. Everything you said is spot on. We can't even address these issues. We can't even express concern about these issues, about who this country is made up of, who this country belongs to, who this country can serve. We can't even make a remark about the way things are going in 2017 without being beaten over the head. Oh, you're just saying that because you're scared. You're just saying that because you're racist. Any natural concern, which is a self-defense mechanism among societies, every society is concerned about demographics, about the future of their kids. Anytime a white person does that, there's a specific word for it. Those concerns are pathologized. They want to make it seem like white people are neurotic. They want to make it seem like there's something wrong with them mentally for even saying something about this. Oh, why are you so scared of who's in your movies? Gosh, you're so fragile. It's a lot of projection to just ridicule people who are naturally concerned about these issues without addressing the fact that they're correct. See, we're spot on with all these topics, but no one's going to admit it. And instead, they're just going to slander our mental health and slander our character for even bringing this up. So back to number 9, we can't even raise these issues without being seen as self-interested or bigoted or having some sort of negative ulterior motive in all this.
You're bang on. I wanted to bring up just a few things that are listed as racist in recent memory. Capitalism, dinosaurs, Civil War reenactments, showing up on time, believing in hard work, Walt Disney statues, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, barbecue. The list goes on and on and on. Black dogs. Science is embarrassingly white, this one says. That's a huge problem. The list goes on and on and on. We're always racist. We can't talk about these things. And this is kind of one of the fundamental issues. They say, well, you can talk about white history. You can talk about the founding of your nation. Well, no, you can't. No, you can't. I distinctly remember, and I don't have it pulled up, colleges are removing Shakespeare because, he's hailed as one of the sort of most prominent figures in Western literary tradition, right? And so they're removing him from colleges. Like, literally, his books are being removed because he's too white. It's insanity. And they're actually literally replacing those books with black authors instead. I kid you not. I wish I could, I wish I had the capacity, the creative capacity to make these things up, but I just can't.
Yeah, I was going to add that in the same theme as he was talking about number 9, that basically you can't even check number 9 because you're really not able to do that. So you can't even check that off. I was going to say you can't check off number 5 either. It's like I can be sure that that my children will be given curricular material. Sorry, it's hard to read. It's kind of small. Curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. It's like, yeah, in fact, they're told the opposite. You're like, every bit of their curriculum tries to say like everything's a melting pot. Everything that was done by people from other places that contributed in their own way and made everything as great as it is. It's not any one people there, so don't get any ideas in your head. Finger wag, like that kind of thing. So I can't even check number 5 off. So I'm losing my privilege. Like I said at the beginning, I think I have privilege, but I'm starting to doubt that now.
I would agree with that. I think that for me, what I really see is that with regard to number 5, my child in her school, in her class, she is the much smaller minority in the group, right? Like there are far fewer, like less than a third of her class is white. And the messaging, the curriculum, the way that they are taught is not a way which echoes white identity, right? Like there is no white identity, there is no Western identity there. It's more about the erasure of identity completely. They do not refer to one another as their names even. They refer to themselves as friends, not even as boys and girls or people, but rather as friends. So they don't have lots of identity there at all. And going to number 6, which I think is a great point, I can go into a music shop and count on finding music of my race represented. I don't feel I can do that anymore. I feel like, especially if you buy into the arguments that bluegrass, that jazz, that rock and roll, if you were to believe common current ideas about those musical genres, they're not white, right? So if I go into a music shop or a music section of a store, can I find classical music? Can I find Baroque? Can I find folk music? Can I find sea shanties? No, of course not. What is white music now? But history, the history of music. It's very bizarre. Like if you look at American culture specifically, it is not dominated musically specifically by white Western musical theory and um, ideas of music. It's very much dominated by this sort of hip hop rap tradition of like the 80s and the 90s. Even pop music now is very much dominated by, um, I would say, Black American culture. It's not dominated by even in all of the Western world now. If you look at the United Kingdom, their most prolific artist right now is not someone singing in traditional European folk music or anything like that, but rather it's a white woman who sings uh, Black American soul music, right? Like she uses R&B. And I'm referring to Adele, but this idea that our types of music or our people are being represented through these mediums, it's just patently false.
It is. There's a real decadence with music that many studies have been written on, as far as certain metrics like how often words are repeated, for example, how complex is the music, and all this. And that's something we could certainly get into another time. But it is fascinating because music does cross racial boundaries, and that whole thing. I mean, first of all, the whole damn checklist is silly, but yeah, music in particular crosses racial boundaries, and it's such a silly thing. Like you said, we don't have my heritage is like Polish/Swedish, right? So where am I going to find that music, right? Just because there's a white person on the album cover, what do I have to listen to country now? I mean, come on. Anyway, number 2 I think is really interesting. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. And I like this one because I have a very, very super liberal gay coworker. I love her to death. I really do. I think she's a lot of fun, and we have a lot in common, except when it comes to politics. And she has worked with children in the past, where she has like adopted them or sort of fostered them and taken them out shopping. And she says, well, we were followed and all this, and security followed us. And I sit there as she's talking about these things, and I say, well, yeah, you catch rats with things like peanut butter and cheese because that's what they like. Statistically, this is just what works, right? If you're looking for drunk drivers, right, you don't go sit on a rural road at 11 p.m. No, you camp out at a major thoroughfare near the bars. And I have pulled up here, and this is from 2012, the statistics for crime, and we'll just go through like robbery. Blacks commit, are you ready for this? 7.27 times the rate of robberies compared to whites. Burglary, 2.64 times. Property crime, we'll exclude property crime, that's like damaging property. Stolen property, 2.72 times that of whites. So you're twice as likely to catch a black man or woman committing things like robbery or shoplifting or stealing. Yeah, I mean, racial profiling is, I suppose, in many ways wrong if it's strictly based on race, but is it wrong to profile when these people are the ones committing the crimes? Like, if you're saying, okay, we don't have any video cameras, we don't have anything, we just have, we're living the place that was burglarized was in a predominantly black area. Well, it stands to reason that it probably wasn't a white guy that came from the suburbs, and committed the crime, right? Anyway, it's a silly point, and the fact is that, so these stereotypes, that blacks are going to steal your things in a store, has its foundations in reality. I myself worked as loss prevention. I was a contracted security officer for loss prevention for a store in a very, very black area of town. And I sure didn't see any white people coming in there stealing things. And we could argue, well, white people aren't living there. Yeah, you're right. But in the white areas of town, you just don't see that happen at all.
Let's say 50% white, 50% black area. You're talking like blacks would be twice as likely to be the offender in most cases, and whatever else. And what was the What was the offense that was 7 times more likely?
It was robbery.
Yeah, so that specifically is if someone robbed a house in a 50% black, 50% white neighborhood, there's a 1 in 7 chance that it's going to be a white person, and that's like half the people that are in that place. The cops, I'm sure, just by experience, would understand this, and they would be like, they want to do their job efficiently. They don't want to just like be egalitarian to a fault. They're just like, they're gonna have a hunch. They're gonna go, you know what, that guy looks suspicious, and if that guy's black, sorry, we're gonna follow him.
I have a lot of theories about criminal justice and law enforcement. Something we can definitely talk about later. But the nuts and bolts of it is that law enforcement cannot be egalitarian. That dragnets must exist for a reason. And yeah, like I said, we can talk about all this some other time. Let's see here. What ones haven't we covered? Let's just go down the list. We definitely touched on 3. We touched on 4. Touched on 5. Touched on 6. Oh, here we go. Number 7. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial responsibility. What does that even mean? Maybe you guys can explain that to me. What does that even mean?
So for me, what I really see in there is the issue of whether you can provide identification for yourself. I'm not sure how, like you said, what does this mean? I don't see how they laid out this argument to mean anything other than, can I pay for the goods that I'm trying to purchase? And the reality is, if you have currency in our society, whether it be through credit or hard paper currency, you can purchase anything that you can legally purchase. And in many cases, even illegally purchase, right? So that question with regard to credit cards and checks would seem to suggest that you cannot prove that you are not the person who is issuing that check or is the holder of that credit. So when I see that, the way that I will look at it is that what you're saying is that you do not have a valid identification to prove that this is a guarantee of legal tender. And no, I don't have that issue, but it's not because of my race. It's because I have a photo identification that says, yes, I am this person who is the holder of this credit or the issuer of these funds through check. And I think that a lot of times what they do, and when I say I think, I mean, what often happens is people who are on the more leftist or culturally Marxist side of things tend to look at that and say that, that is a racist or a white privilege aspect of our institutions. But really what it's saying is that, no, unfortunately, or fortunately, or I'm sorry, what it's saying is, unfortunately, blacks tend to, or Hispanics tend to, not have valid identification to prove that they are the holder of this credit or that they are the true issuer of this check or do not hold a guaranteed funding for the item that they're trying to purchase.
Well, it goes without saying. Also, the rates of forgery, counterfeiting, and fraud are almost 3 times that of whites. So maybe the appearance of financial responsibility, what does that mean? Like, is that about dressing?
I was looking through the list to see if there's anything about supervisors or managers. I thought I saw it, but I wanted to tie that into number 7 about finance. Well, first of all, there are disparities amongst credit scores amongst different groups of people. You can take that as you will. It has to do with impulsiveness, ability to think ahead for the future, ability to plan for the future, and ability to delay gratification. And you'll see different temperaments and habits based on the mental ability to perceive the future. And obviously, different groups of people are going to have different abilities to do so. But what I think is very interesting is that in my personal experience, I worked at a bank. And the reason I brought up managers is that my manager was a black man. He was a temporary manager because one of my former managers quit. And we had a great time. He was a very, he wasn't necessarily red pilled, but he was very woke on, alternative uh, theories to issues. He's a big supporter of Malcolm X, things of that nature. But we worked well together in the financial industry, and we never judged anyone based on race. And I've seen financial slackers of many different skin colors. So this is just more disingenuous race baiting as part of cultural Marxism, and it's completely ridiculous. Although to be fair, stereotypes do exist. Like I said, it does exist for different temperaments and different abilities to save your money and delay your gratification. Are you putting it into savings, or are you just going to go buy some J's? And that's just the reality of nature. And there's definitely things people can do to uplift their community and to get people thinking about better finance, but that's not my fault, and that's not anyone's fault here.
I read a very interesting study once that sort of addressed. So what it was kind of doing was talking about why crime exists in such high quantities in black neighborhoods, for example. One of the interesting conclusions was that spending habits are very, very different. Blacks tend to spend more on outward appearance. Things like you could be living in an impoverished neighborhood, but you buy a very nice car, for example. And God, what is it called? It's like it's basically perceived wealth disparity. And so because of that, so let's just say everybody in a neighborhood is making an average of let's say 25,000, right? You're just above poverty, you're scraping by, right? Everybody's making 25,000, and the guy down the street, let's just say 2 doors down, ends up with a really, really nice car with some brand new rims, and it's he always comes out of his house with nice clothes. And let's also say, for example, that nobody's committing any crime. There's no sort of under the table dealings, right? There would be a perceived income disparity there, right? Because they're saying, well, how come I'm living here and I have a crappy car? The car is made in the 1980s. The belts are going bad. The spark plugs just need to replace, and all the tires are damn near flat. How come he can afford that, right? He must be making more than me. Well, in fact, he's not. He's sort of, in many ways, sort of showing off. It's peacocking of sorts, where oh, hey, look, I spent my money on this, but everybody's making the same amount. And it's very, very interesting. It's a very neat sort of aspect of human psychology and the differences between the way, for example, whites and blacks and even Hispanics spend their money.
Yeah, I think that the idea of wealth and the perception and projection of wealth and value ties very well into number 8, which is, I am not made acutely aware that my shape, bearing, or body odor will be taken as a reflection on my race. I say that because for whites, there's this very large perception that if you care about being white, if you care about being, if you care about the identity of being a white, then what you are doing is bolstering yourself on the success of your ancestors rather than the success of your current state or your current population. And then where you get into that is, oh, well, you're just hillbillies. Oh, well, you're just inbred. Oh, you're just dirty trailer trash. That the only people who are white that care about being white are poor, are filthy. They're the unwashed masses. They have nothing left to hold on to other than their whiteness, their perceived whiteness, and what value that gives them, rather than their own personal individual value. And so I think that's a very interesting thing that Peggy would include, because again, to be white means that you must demonstrate your value personally. White Western culture means that you cannot rest on the haunches of, or rest on your haunches because of the success of your ancestors, right? You can very quickly see that if you come from a successful family and you are not yourself successful, then you will be hyper criticized. If you do not stand up to the success of your ancestors, then you will be very critically assessed based on your own value. And I think that that's something that a lot of people outside of the white Western race just don't understand. They don't understand that if you cannot live up to or exceed the success of your ancestors, and I think this is a really difficult hurdle for a lot of people, then you are not seen as valuable. You are not seen as successful, regardless of what success you do have. If you cannot have the actual or perceived success of your ancestors, regardless of whether or not that's feasible in a current state, then you failed, and you will view yourself as a failure, and basically everything else that you've accomplished will lose some value just based on what your expectations are.
Yeah, and not to like completely diminish what you were saying, but like the the absolute randomness of number 8, it's just like, it's like I stink, therefore like I feel like people are gonna think that my entire race stinks or something. It's like, what what is this woman even going on about? Like, I didn't want to derail everything you were saying, Western man, but like I was just like taken aback by that, just like the weirdness of that entire example.
You know, it's interesting. There is sort of a meme in the black community that white people smell like hot dogs and / or potato chips. And it's, as I said, I worked in a corrections environment, and I can tell you, like, body odor differs amongst the races. It just does. I'm sure that there is, well, actually, I know for a fact that there are reasons for it that go beyond things like diet, right? There are, oh God, what is it? There's certain genes, right, that people have, and it affects, like, it's really, really interesting, actually. Your earwax, right? The texture of your earwax also is indicative on if you have this gene, and it's sort of the amount of body odor that you put off, right? So, like, let's just say you take 5 black people, 5 white people, 5 Asian people, and 5 Hispanic people, and every single one of them takes a shower and doesn't put on any deodorant, and then you smell them after, let's just say, 48 hours, right? The white people will typically smell less bad because of the genes that they have that affect sort of body odor, right? I mean, I wish I had it pulled up. God, I didn't expect to be talking about body odor today, but yeah, it's true that there actually is genetic, biological reasons for differences in body odor. It's just a fact.
Well, we can broaden the genetic differences topic. We can just start, like, I like to talk about genetic differences and like inherent genetic differences between races and sub races and nationalities and stuff, and like even just the way that different even Celts behave, for example. Like, there's different ways that like Scots and Irish people behave, and it's really interesting to see, and like to like hold them up to each other and say like, oh, you guys do this and you guys tend to do that, and that's really cool. And I don't think that one of you guys should die out as opposed to the other. I don't think that we should lose this, and we should celebrate our differences. And I really enjoy that, and I find it really interesting, no matter where you are in the world. Actually, like, I want to know like what makes you work and what the quirks of your people are. It's very interesting to see like such such a true diversity spread throughout all of the earth, really.
Yeah, it is interesting. What makes us different? What makes us tick, right? So I actually pulled it up briefly here. There is a bacteria called micrococci, I'm guessing. I don't know. My Latin's poor. And there is let me see, Corynebacterium. Okay, that causes the stinky armpit, right? Now, there was a 2006 study done that shows, here's a red pill, boom, dropping it. The genetics behind wet versus dry earwax was discovered in 2006, okay? Dry earwax is very common, 80 to 95% among East Asians, but is lower, 30 to 50% in Southern Asia, Pacific Islands, Central Asia, and Asia Minor, and in Native North Americans and Inuit peoples of Asian ancestry. It is very uncommon among Europeans and Africans, 0 to 3%. Now, this is interesting because, are you ready? This variation turns out to have effects on the liver, pancreas, kidneys, placenta, breast tissue, gut, glands in your ear canal, and sweat glands. So, what this tells us is, in fact, there are differences in the way our bodies produce body odor. East Asians, in particular, are just not that stinky. I mean, there is a science to it. I mean, is that racist? Are we racist for talking about earwax? I mean, what makes us tick? Hell, I don't know. Number 10 here. I can take a job or enroll in a college with an affirmative action policy without having my coworkers or peers assume I got it because of my race. I love this one. I just love this one. How about, crazy idea here, how about quit giving preferential treatment and then that would go away, right? When Asians are, I think it's like a 200 some odd point deduction on their SATs, blacks are getting like I don't remember, it's something like a 300 point bonus. This is incredible. If you do away with this preferential treatment, that idea would go away overnight. You would have earned it. This is no longer a meritocracy. Affirmative action has done away with the idea of a meritocracy. So, yeah, of course there's going to be a bias. It's like you didn't earn your way in here. I had to work harder to get to the same position you are. I mean, of course.
Yeah, if you had to climb up like the straight 90-degree angle, grabbing rocks to climb up this mountain while someone just walked up the other side, you're going to feel like you accomplished more even though you're both at the top. Going along with that that theme, even just affirmative action in general, we know that that's just directed at white people. Like, that's it. So there's no reason like that anyone would assume that because it's directed at white people. Yeah, we're going to be like, yeah, we got that, and not yeah, no one's going to assume that a white person got in a position because of affirmative action, because no one's going to get it. No white person is going to get it because of affirmative action. Everyone knows that it's distinctly targeting white people. Like, in fact, you get it in spite of your race. Like, good for you if you're a white person with a job or have gotten to college, because the odds were stacked that much more against you.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think that I can't say that I'm getting a job because of my race through affirmative action policy, but only because I can't claim to benefit from it at all. And what's really interesting about affirmative action policy is that it is very tailored to a specific race, right? So you spoke on the issue of how Asians are negatively affected in certain institutions. Well, go back further to that, and even more so than African Americans, because they're a much smaller percentage of the population, they are negatively impacted by these policies, by quota policies. And in fact, I'm not sure if it's the Supreme Court or just a federal court. They're actually challenging affirmative action right now because they are being excluded from college admissions because, right, because they are not black, and a certain percentage of positions are guaranteed to those of African descent, even though they're not as qualified for the position necessarily.
Before you go, maybe you can talk on this, because I have a relative that works in a bank, and there are laws in place right now, current year, 2017, where quotas are given to the bank by the government and say you must give a certain number of loans, regardless of risk, to minorities, right? Did that exist in the bank you were at too?
Well, I could talk about that from my undergraduate studies. You're referencing the Community Reinvestment Act, which I had to study as part of my training. What it says is that you do have to reinvest a lot of your funds, a lot of your deposits into your community, and you can't discriminate based on, race, identity, gender fluid, queerness, whatever. But yeah, exactly. So the CRA was passed in the 1970s under a Democrat Congress, and Republicans like to point that with a larger degree of accuracy as the reason for the shakiness in the financial crisis. So you had a lot of loans given out to people of poor credit who correlate with being people of color, and just loans were given out, and all you had to do to show for it was just have a pulse. No down payment, low percentage interest. And to make a long story short, when the banks needed some cash, they started calling in these loans. Well, a lot of these people couldn't pay back because they don't have good financial habits. They're spending it on material possessions, or they just bought the house to show off to the neighbors, to the family. So yeah, the CRA was a terrible policy in the way it was implemented, because it was financial affirmative action. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they put too many chips on that horse, to use a very obscure metaphor that I kind of just made up. They got dragged down because of that. And it wasn't just, minorities and people of color. It was also the predatory nature of the finance gurus in Wall Street. But it's a little bit of both. And so, yeah, your relative is spot on with that analysis.
Yeah, it blew my mind. I mean, I knew that places like colleges had quotas, but holy crap, banks? I mean, wow. I mean, they will literally get shut down if they don't give loans to X number of blacks, Mexicans, and so on. And so what do, right? You're at the end of the month or the end of the year, and you're like, oh crap, we haven't given enough loans to minorities. You're going to scramble. You're going to get whatever you can, and you're going to take whoever you can.
My understanding is that the feds aren't going to get on your case if you don't fill a quota, but someone can definitely file suit against you if they feel like they've been discriminated based on race. So it's a little bit of a murky ground, which of course is intended to, shake up the foundations of a financial system, which is based on trust. So I mean, it's possible that, the feds will go after you if you don't have a quota. On a similar note, the Obama administration was targeting zip codes, area codes, for not having enough diversity. So they would disperse Section 8 money into white neighborhoods to increase the diversity, to promote just forced multiculturalism, which goes against the freedom of association. So it's all related. In fact, that kind of ties in with number 15. Traffic cop pulls me over. Well, you referenced that, just smart policing. But the IRS audits. Well, hey, guess what? Guess who got targeted by IRS audits in real life? It was conservatives, the Tea Party. All people of the same ethnic backgrounds, all white people there. So yeah, just complete ridiculousness with the double standards.
What I think is really interesting about that is how it ties into number 11, which is that this idea that your race would somehow excuse you, or that your actions will somehow negatively reflect on your race or not negatively affect on your race just because you are a certain race, right? So with number 11, right, it says, I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect on my race. Well, people of my race typically are not late because they understand the value. It is a cultural institution in us, right? We understand the value of being there early, right? On time is late. That is drilled into you at a very young age, at least in my experience. But if it isn't, then it's not a reflection on my race or my people, but rather me as an individual, because the expectation is that you will not be late. You will be there on time or early. And on time is not considered, a minute after or 5 minutes after. On time is considered on time, on schedule. And so if the majority of the people of my race, which I happen to be, right? I didn't choose my race. I just happen to be this race, are on time, then yes, of course. If I am late, it won't reflect on my race, but rather on myself. But if the majority of people of my race are viewed as irresponsible, right? They don't hold their word to make a meeting on time, then of course, if I am late, I will reinforce that idea. And so I think it's silly to state this as a white privilege issue, right? Because it's not. It's about whether or not your culture, your people value punctuality or value anything at all on this list, right? That's really what this is about. It's about stating that, does your culture value these things? Yes or no? And if you do, and if it does, then you are privileged because you value these traits, these things.
Well, it was drilled into my head. The saying was 10 minutes early to 10 minutes early, right? I mean, that's a pretty good way to look at it, I think. If you're not 20 minutes early something, then you don't care enough.
Yeah, and we should look at this all like context too. Like this is in the context of like they're talking about like white people aren't negatively affected by it, and they're probably just saying like, let's say like a black person's late. They're saying that white people are going. They're saying that white people are going to think negatively about one's entire race because of the actions of one person. White people are afraid to do that. Like white people they'd be like, oh, like they would like be like hitting themselves in the head for thinking bad thoughts about the race of a person. Like they're like, oh no, it's all about the individual. That particular individual might be slow and tardy all the time, but that doesn't say anything about his race. Like I know a white guy who's like that. Uh, that homeless guy down the road, he's a white guy who's like that. So it really like doesn't even work in context. Like, and there is a context to this entire like white privilege thing, because it's just made to attack white people, obviously, and the context they're using it in doesn't even make sense. They're trying to make a quip about colored time, basically.
They are. Let me see, where are we at here? Public accommodation, blah blah blah, because my people will can't get in or will be mistreated. I think that one speaks for itself. It's total bullshit. Nobody's mistreating blacks, Hispanics, or Asians. That's just silly. I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. I think, again, this one it's not even worth discussing. Because there are certain benefits to that too, right? Like, if you're an extremely high IQ black man, that's seen as a good thing, and they will hold you up and say, wow, look at this black guy who really succeeded. But, you can't do the same for anything bad. Here's the manager one there, Fuego. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I'll be facing a person of my race. That's silly. I don't even know if I have anything to say about there.
thought I was going crazy because I read it at first and I couldn't find it. But yeah, there you go. I mean, I honestly don't really care what race the person is, the manager. I just care that the job gets done. But like someone said earlier, white people tend to be the least concerned with the race you are. So, this is only an issue for non-whites.
Yeah, well, I mean, what difference does it make, right? And this is a genuine question. Like, the subtext to this, okay? Let me read it again. The subtext to this is fascinating to me. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk with the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. What does that mean? That means, like, if you're a black man or a black woman, you expect to go in. Like, that would please you if you don't talk to somebody of your race. That's a problem to me.
I think what's really interesting about that is that this idea, and it kind of harkens back to the representation question of race, right? That if the person being represented, if the race being represented by the person is not like yours or is not yours, then they have no validity, right? Like that's the insinuation here. So does it mean that if I go into the office and my director or my president of my company is not white, that any criticism that he levels upon me, any accountability that he would like to hold me to, is no longer valid because he doesn't represent my race? I'm really not sure where they're going with this. Should I not ever expect to be held accountable to by a black man or an Indian man or an Asian man? I think if we were to take some of these things and put them to the test of, well, should an Asian be accountable to a white man? Should a black man be accountable to an Asian man? Should a white woman be accountable to a Hispanic woman? If we start to ask these questions and really vet these statements, these lines of white privilege, they really start to come undone when you try to apply them to others or to the other, right? And it's this whole idea that it's not about whether or not the person is different than you or that they should be different than you. It's about, are they white? Yes. Well, that's bad, right? Are you white? Yes. Well, that's bad in this scenario. And I think that we really need to be cautious about how we address this. Like I've never, right? I've never had a manager or superior who was harder on me than someone of my own race and gender. I've never had that, right? Like the expectations are always lower. Now, are they always fair or more fair? No, absolutely not. But that's what's so crazy about it, right? And I think we really need to, this is an issue we really need to delve into on the whole, right? About representation and leadership, or just leadership in general, and how we relate to it, or what the expectation is. Because I think that if you really delve into it and you look at nepotism, you look at favoritism, you look at application of accountability or disciplinary action amongst other groups and amongst whites, you will see, or even Westerners, right? Amongst Westerners, then you'll see a very clear distinction that Westerners and whites tend to be meritocratic based, whereas other groups tend to be nepotistic. They tend to show favoritism towards their groups. And I think that's something we really need to look at hard.
Yeah, I'd say that that egalitarian, that meritocratic view where it's like, well, if you can do it, you can do it, or if you can do the job, you can do the job, no matter who you are. I don't see skin color or whatever. That literally comes out of a particular people. Like that, even not seeing skin color comes out of a particular skin color. It's a part of a particular culture, and that is white culture.
It is, absolutely. Number 15, and this one I think is kind of funny. We're almost to the end here. If a traffic cop pulls me over or the IRS audits my tax returns, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. they have to throw in, well, she, Peggy, has to throw in if a traffic cop pulls me over. And this is funny to me because if you look at who gets audited, people who file international returns, people who file estate tax returns for assets worth more than $5 million, and people who report more than $10 million in income or none at all. So, if that's the case, I don't think black people are being, disproportionately audited by the IRS. Maybe pulled over. Maybe we can certainly talk about that. But then the question becomes, well, are they committing more traffic offenses?
I think the really interesting bit there is the issue with the IRS. Now, I've been audited twice, and I can promise you I'm not worth 10 million or more. I'm not filing internationally, any of those stipulations, right? But I have been audited, and I had to do a lot of legwork just to prove that as a single white male, that the claims that I had to support myself and no one else, the fact that I was paying this, even though I used the non-itemized general deduction, I still got audited, even though they know I have nothing to back it up because I'm using the general deduction, the standard deduction, and I still got audited. I've been audited twice. So it makes me hesitant to actually use, and perhaps this is why we have this issue, to use an itemized deduction, right? I'd love to write off my childcare. I'd love to write off my gas mileage, my mileage every day commuting to work. I'd love to write off tons of business expenses. But, for me now that I've been audited twice, just using a standard deduction, it makes me wonder, well gee, what sort of what sort of test do I need to pass in order to get through an audit if I'm using an itemized deduction? Like, do I need to be able to pull up receipts from 2 years ago? Do I need to be able to prove I paid for gas on this day? What do I need to do to prove as a white man, right, that I have done this thing? And what's really suspicious to me about this sort of claim, right? Every time I've crossed the border into Canada, never gone to Mexico, no real desire there, I've been stopped and searched at length, right? They went through every aspect of my car. And this is going into Canada and coming out. Like, they searched everything, right? And I'm a white man, just driving a normal American-made car. But I would be searched relentlessly. So it really is suspicious to me, or rather it's disingenuous, that this statement is always, well, we're being more targeted, right? We're being targeted for this, we're being targeted for that. Well, are you being targeted because of your race or because of your personal action?
That's very interesting that you were searched on the border of Canada. I hope the Canadian NSA is not listening to this, but when I was on a family trip, we crossed the border and we had our cat in the car, and they didn't even bother to look inside the window and see that we were bringing in a live animal. We were only going for a couple of days, but my experience was quite the opposite. But I can relate that to an infamous photo that is circulated amongst people who are into this sort of things, of this old white woman getting searched at the airport by a lady in hijab, the Muslim dress, and just the imagery just strikes you as just so wrong. I mean, as someone was referencing profiling earlier, I mean, let's be real. The people who are committing these airline hijackings and terrorism and trucks of peace all come from the religion of peace. It's not going to be your grandma Dorothy doing this, but we have to set up this outrageous bureaucracy and these outrageous standards who target the wrong people time and again because we're operating under a false notion of equality. What's now being called the equality principle. So yeah, it's just a huge burden that the state is imposing upon our people. Undemocratically, no one asked for this. It's just foisted upon us. And we all have to bear this burden on behalf of others who are agitating for this nonsense.
Yeah, I saw that picture that you were referring to with the Muslim woman like scanning down a woman who was standing there with her arms out and her legs spread out, and she was being scanned down and walked around by this Muslim girl. Um, and I saw it because someone on some like he was like a younger gay white dude, liberal, posted it on his Facebook feed, and I saw it on my feed, and it was like a joke. Like they were like, haha, look at this old white woman getting scanned down, like as like a in your face, like you thought it was going to be like over over searching or like going after Muslims, but aha, joke's on you, old white woman. Kind of bothers me, kind of triggers me.
Well, this is kind of the thing, isn't it? There's this idea floating around that, you know, and it's of course only floating around in leftist circles, but there's this idea floating around that, you know, if we show ourselves to be just truly altruistic and good people, and we open our arms and embrace all of these people, that they will show the same in return. But in fact, you know, because I've seen things like that too, where they say, "Haha, it's about time you get that." The reality is that when we become a minority, because at this point the trajectory is that we will be, you know, unless things change, it's going to be extremely discriminatory because of these sort of ginned up fake grievances that people have. You know, we're gonna see it perhaps in our lifetimes. I think we're all relatively young enough. We're going to see in our lifetimes that things are going to be returned by orders of magnitude against white people. It is just not. It's not going to change. It's not going to change, and this is why we have to stand up for ourselves, not just as white people, but I mean, for God's sake, everybody needs to stand up for themselves. And the important thing is that they're keeping things grounded in reality. Maybe that's the fundamental issue, that, you know, we can talk about, you know, kneeling and, you know, in the NFL and racial discrimination. Well, you know, when you guys are shooting at cops, that's kind of what happens. You know, when you're doing these things, that's what happens. And you know, it's all these fake issues that don't truly exist, have no foundation in reality, and it's only, you know, when we are the minority, it's only going to be returned in a much more cruel way, I feel.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. And I think what's really interesting, though, is that if you look at the boomer generation of Black America, right? You look at the silent generation of Black America, the mentality and the work ethic and the approach to their identity is completely different than that of modern Black America, right? If you look at the current year, Black America, this notion that work and um, effort are valuable is not there, right? They see this notion as a weakness rather than a strength. Whereas 2 generations ago, it was, this is what will set us free. And that's what's so hard for me personally to grasp, because I've worked with so many people who are Black that are from previous generations, and I wonder what went wrong. Where did they go wrong? And it's not them, right? And I think that what you said is interesting, right? Like, those same people have no issue with those people of African heritage or Asian heritage saying, you know what, I'm really proud of what my people have accomplished, so long as they can demonstrate that their people actually accomplished it. You know, that's where we kind of get into this meme of, well, the Chinese have invented everything, or, you know, Africans were really the true Egyptians, and the Vikings were the true, or were truly Muslim Africans or Middle Easterners of some kind. It's all about, can you be proud of what you can demonstrate that your people did? And Westerners have no issue with being proud of what you can actually demonstrate you accomplished. And that's what's really interesting to me, is that those who have not accomplished much have a tendency to project that, well, we have accomplished nothing, so we would like to claim parts of these accomplishments.
Yeah, you see that with the what was that movie? The super based three black women that launched the shuttle, right? They were truly responsible for it, right? You see that. I mean, Hidden Figures. Hidden Figures is what it was. I mean, oh my God, there's no end, and it's deconstruction 101, and there is no end. But gentlemen, we are approaching an hour and a half now, so we'll bump through the rest of these real quickly. We already talked about 16. We cannot actually buy posters. There's a typo there. Real good job there, Peggy. Posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, dolls, blah, 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 featuring people of my race. You probably could find some that have your people represented. You probably could. Everybody can say that. I was just at the store and I saw plenty of postcards with little black kids, little black precious moments, characters on them. Yeah, okay. God, this thing is so silly. I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. Well, sorry, I guess that white men created bandages? I don't know. Flesh-colored. This is the thing, who created Band-Aids? Well, it was probably a white guy. Well, if you're trying to match... First of all, as a very pale white guy, the flesh-colored bandages don't match my skin color. Am I unprivileged?
I think that's great because as a very pale person myself, I've never found a bandage that matches my skin color. I've actually abandoned bandages and started using the liquid bandages because it tends to work better. But yeah, I think that's hilarious. I've never been peach colored myself or beige. I'm very very much too pale for that.
Liquid bandage preferred, of course, because there is no subtle oppressive bourgeois microaggression against your skin color.
Yeah, I'd say the majority population of any of this particular area is white. So, sorry, bro. They want to sell to majority population. That's the point of capitalism half the time. Yeah, they're going to try to appeal to the biggest pool they can, and the biggest pool, for the time being, is white people.
It is, but capitalism is racist. Remember, we talked about that. Oh, Lord. So I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. Well, we know for a fact this is false. We know for a fact because we see it all the time. And I don't have any examples pulled up, so I can't exactly quote them or put them on screen. But, oh my God, we know this is false. Of course that happens. 100% of the time. Wow. I can walk into a classroom and know I will not be the only member of my race. Oh, God. This one really bothers me. Because, like I said at the very, very beginning, I know we're on an hour and a half now, but like I said at the very beginning, if you go to your native country, that is not a problem at all. And as Western One says, for God's sake, anymore, that's not the case for white people. By this metric, we're becoming less and less privileged each day. I just recently I was looking at a census report, and the white population is dwindling rapidly in America. Something like a 5% decrease in 2000 to 2010. So. And the whole thing with privilege is, so okay, thin privilege, for example. So to counteract thin privilege, are you supposed to get to 800 pounds? And if you're 800 pounds, is somebody who's only 600 pounds less privileged or more privileged than you? I don't understand.
My daughter is the scant minority in her group, in her school, in her class, even. And the real issue there that I see is that she is in a class that, with the exception of 3 white boys and 2 other white girls, right? So out of a class of 20, 14 members of the class are either mixed race or black, and then there are 6 white children. So you can do the math there, right? Like, she is not represented. Are the teachers white? Well, one teacher is white and one teacher is Jewish. So she's not really seeing any representation of her race other than her close friends who happen to be white and her teachers.
Well, that ties in perfectly with the final point here, and one that I want to harp on for just a minute. So I think we can all stick around for the last one here, because there's an interesting word that I wanna pick out. I can enroll in a class at college and be sure that here's the word, majority of my professors will be of my race. All I'm hearing when I read that is, I want to be a black person taught by black people. So everything that, the whole civil rights movement, that we deserve equal education, we deserve to go to white schools, and all that means nothing, because the majority of professors must be of my race. And there's an interesting problem here, right? Because you can never have that. Because, let's say you have an Asian child living in a predominantly black area, okay? That Asian child goes and enrolls in a class, and they somehow have the expectation that not all, that the majority of professors should be Asian? That's not, what? That doesn't make any sense. These people need to realize you live in a white country, well, a dwindling white country, but a white country, and, the majority of people who are going to be professors are going to be white, and that's okay. That's not a problem.
Yeah, this is the issue where we're going to have to go back to the universal answer that you said we shouldn't bust out, but now is the time to bust it out. This is just not going to happen in a majority white country. You're never going to see that. And if anything, this is a reason for balkanization or what have you. Harvard was agitating for an all-black graduation. And at this point, if that's what they want, I think that's the way to go. Just part amicably and just, say, the past was the past, wasn't working out, so let's just go our separate ways. But what's really onerous about this one, gosh, it's so annoying, is that it's not enough for any of these people. Like, it has, yeah, like you said, it has to be a majority. But what are we concerned about? We're not even concerned about the race of our professors. A lot of us were former conservatives, like, basic uh, MAGA conservatives. We're concerned about every single professor just crapping on our ideals. Almost all my professors are just anti-white, anti-West, anti-founding fathers, regardless of their skin color. They're all brainwashed liberals. So I'm not concerned about the race of my professors, and I'm not privileged if they're all white, because all the white professors are going to be towing the line, towing the academia line, saying what they have to say in that liberal echo chamber known as college.
I think what's really interesting about this whole point, though, is that this notion that if, again, and this is something that they've touched on multiple times in this manifesto, is that if the person who is leading me, is teaching me, is not my specific race, and oftentimes, though not specifically in this manifesto, gender, then they have no business teaching me, that they have no business leading me, that they have no value whatsoever with regard to me, because we don't identify as the same thing, right? And yet at the same time, they say, well, race doesn't matter. Well, if it doesn't matter, why does it matter? And there's this really clear contradiction that never gets addressed. And I think it's really something that I'm a conservative, and a traditionalist. I think we really need to start pushing back on and saying, you know what? If you don't agree with it, then why do you say this, right? Why do you say race matters but doesn't matter? Pick one. Pick a side and really argue for it. If you don't believe that whites can ever live in a society and not be racist and not prefer themselves over others, then perhaps it is time to part ways. But, right, and you brought up a great point. If that's true, then how can a white institution like Harvard ever get to a point where they would actually argue for an all-black graduation? Right? If we're so terrible, if we're so racist, if we're so in-group focused, how could we ever have an institution get to that point? How could we ever have this argument at all? That we are privileged, right? We would never be open to the idea if we were as racist as we think we are, right? So I think that the minority groups that live amongst us really need to take a step back and think, okay, are things really as bad as we think they are? Or perhaps are we being led astray by certain bad actors? Because I think if they really take a long and hard critical look at their situation and their life, they may come to find that they are actually privileged as opposed to oppressed.
Yeah, and in that vein, or just responding to number 15 itself, they're upset that in a majority white country, the majority of teachers or professors are white. Like, so they're upset that we're maintaining a majority numbers in a majority white country. Essentially, they're upset that there's just a lot of white people around in a white country, and they want to change that. And you could see that theme in general. Like, they just don't like white people. That's all it is, and it's literally just that simple.
It is that simple. And, in the same breath, this has always fascinated me. They say America is so racist that we should bring more non-whites here. What a fantastic idea. We are so oppressed, we're so hated, we should bring more people here to be oppressed and hated. What? Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this is all, ginned up and is all a lie. And I don't know. Well, gentlemen, thank you all for showing up and sort of dissecting this and talking about it with me. I really appreciate all of you. Thanks again to Deused, Fuego, Western One, and we will see you in the next episode.